Berlin Wall, 1961 to 1989, the Cold War. The Berlin Wall would become a symbol of ideological division and suppression of human rights during the Cold War. It represented the Iron Curtain that separated Western Europe and the Eastern Bloc. In August 1961, the communist government of the German Democratic Republic of East Germany began construction of the wall and placement of barbed wire between West Berlin and the East. Its purpose was to stop Western fascists from entering the socialist state of East Germany and stopping defections from east to west. It would continue to do so until November 9, 1989, when the East German regime announced that its citizens had the right to cross the border when they wanted. The wall goes up. When World War II came to an end in 1945, the victors came together at the Yalta and Potsdam conferences to split Germany into 4 Allied occupation zones. East Germany would go to the Soviet Union, while the western part went to the United States, Great Britain, and France. Even though Berlin was located entirely within the Soviet part of the country, the city would be split into 4 sectors in the same way. The Russians were determined to remove the United States, Britain, and France from Berlin. A Soviet blockade in 1948 attempted to starve them from the city. However, the United States and its allies resisted by dropping food and fuel supplies from aircraft, which became known as the Berlin Airlift. The booming western sector, which was the showcase of capitalism, contrasted sharply to the economically poorer east. Many German refugees flowed from the east to the west, including highly skilled workers such as doctors, teachers, and engineers. Between 1945 to 1961, 15 to 20% of the East German population had left to the west. Premier Nikita Khrushchev, leader of the Soviet Union, had had enough and gave the East German government permission to close Berlin's borders for good. On the night of August 12th and 13th, 1961, East German soldiers, the police force, and volunteer construction workers laid down barbed wire and a cinder block wall which stretched over 100 miles. As the decades went on, the wall developed into a more sophisticated one, featuring a series of tall concrete walls, electrified fences, fortifications, and watchtowers. Escaping East Berlin. Now people would no longer be able to cross freely with ease to go to work or shop, as they had done before. Now, in order to get from west to east, they had to pass through border crossings. The most famous were checkpoints Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie. But there were several other border crossings. Which checkpoints or border crossings could be used also depended on nationality, dependent on whether they were West Germans or foreigners or a status such as military personnel or diplomats. West Berliners or West Germans, as well as foreigners, could apply for a visa to get into East Berlin. East Berliners and East Germans, however, were not permitted to cross the border to West Berlin or West Germany. In October 1961, U.S. Chief of Mission in West Berlin E. Allen Leitner was stopped in his car by East German police. This prevention of access for American officials to East Berlin caused a standoff between American and Soviet tanks, which faced off at Checkpoint Charlie. For many hours, both sides stared each other down, waiting for their enemy to fire. The potential for World War III was eventually averted when President John F. Kennedy contacted Nikita Khrushchev and convinced him to withdraw his tanks. The American tanks also backed away soon after. Armed soldiers patrolled the wall and would shoot anyone on sight attempting to escape. Ditches, barbed wire, guard dogs, searchlights, and minefields were also set up to prevent escape attempts. Buildings overlooking the wall were demolished or had their windows bricked up so that people could not escape by jumping from them. At least 171 people were killed trying to cross the wall, but this didn't mean that escape was impossible. Hundreds of East Germans tried to escape across the wall, including by flying in a hot air balloon, by zip line, on a tightrope, in a car without a windshield, by swimming, and through a tunnel. President John F. Kennedy visited Berlin on June 26, 1963. He made a speech known as Ich bin ein Berliner, referring to himself as a Berliner in spirit, as a way of ensuring that the United States would fully support West Berliners and Germans. This would be a big morale boost, but while President John F. Kennedy protested, he realized a wall was better than war. On June 12, 1987, U.S. President Ronald Reagan arrived in West Berlin for its 750th anniversary celebration. In his speech at the Brandenburg Gate, he challenged Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down the wall. The fall of the wall. On November 9, 1989, with the Cold War thawing and political changes happening across the Eastern Bloc, the East German government announced that all GDR citizens could visit West Germany and West Berlin. Günter Schabowski, the East German communist official who was the unofficial spokesman, had announced a new freedom of travel for East Germans to the West, in that they could apply for visas from the state agency in an orderly manner. In an unprepared interview, after not having all the information, he said to journalists, "We have decided today to implement a regulation that allows every citizen of the German Democratic Republic to leave East Germany through any of the border crossings." And when asked when this would take effect, he responded, "According to my information, immediately, without delay." From this interpretation, thousands of East Germans gathered around the checkpoints and the wall, creating a party atmosphere. Then the crowd of East Germans crossed the border and climbed onto the wall, celebrating with West Germans on the other side. People knocked down the wall with hammers, and soon with the help of bulldozers, it was pulled down. The reunification of East and West Germany was made official on October 3, 1990. Berlin Wall Border Troops, German Democratic Republic, National People's Army. Until 1961, the control of the border was under the jurisdiction of the German border police, the Grenzpolizei, but from that point on, it began to be considered as a military matter. Border troops of the army, the Grenztruppen, were formed to protect the inner border with Western Germany, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, and the wall surrounding West Berlin. Since it was part of the army, border troops were organized on the same basis as the rest of the army. Men were recruited from the population between ages 18 to 26, and their service lasted for 18 months. Those who wanted to could prolong their engagement in order to be promoted into NCOs or non-commissioned officers. One of the things that attracted young men from East Germany to the border troops was that they were promised a better education and help in seeking a good civilian job once their service was over. Even though the role of border troops was a popular one, recruiting criteria was very strict. Future soldiers had to be politically correct, as they were to protect the border against the capitalist enemy literally on their doorstep. Those who had even the smallest record of political dissent, or even those whose closest relatives had showed these traits, were not allowed to join the border troops. Religiousness was also a big drawback in qualification. Another important criteria was that the potential bordermen were not residents of areas near the border with West Germany. These criteria were set up because the government didn't want former bordermen to help escapees. Those who had close relatives in West Germany were also not considered for the job. The basic training of the border troops was identical to those in the rest of the army. Bordermen were, however, additionally taught various inspection and patrol skills, observing, dog handling, and even laying mines. Intense training was conducted in order to take their shooting skills to a high level. Every borderman was obliged to shoot 2 moving targets at a distance of 200 meters using only 4 rounds. Such skills prepared them for the task of taking down real-life escapee targets. The main field of training was, however, political indoctrination, as the army didn't want to have any hesitant shooters in their ranks. More than half of the entire training process was dedicated to the political shaping of the bordermen. The uniforms and equipment of the border troops were also the same as the rest of the army. Bordermen wore standard stone-gray uniforms with dark green collar signs and shoulder stripes. On their heads they wore caps or standard East German wide helmets, which were worn in situations of high alertness. For the equipment, border troops used weapons of Soviet origin made in East Germany. From the rise of the Berlin Wall in 1961, the East German army started to receive modern weapons to replace the old weapons from the World War II era. The standard sidearm of the bordermen was the 9mm Soviet Makarov, while the main weapon was the MPIK assault rifle, a copy of the Soviet AK-47 Kalashnikov. Every soldier carried one of these with 2 magazines of ammunition. There were also IMGK and IMGD light machine guns, which were copies of the Soviet RPK and RPD. All of these weapons were in the standard Soviet caliber 7.62mm. Even though the new caliber of 5.45mm appeared later, border troops continued to use old ammunition. Border troops were also equipped with heavy machine guns and RPGs. As an addition to this arsenal of weapons, border patrols had German Shepherd dogs specialized in searching for people that were hiding. Observing the borderline, as well as the class enemy on the other side, was achieved with the use of binoculars, which were a standard piece of equipment for bordermen on patrol. Portable radios were also supplied for faster communication. Soldiers on duty on watchtowers had static, more powerful binoculars. These binoculars allowed bordermen to have a better overview and a secure control over a huge area of the border region. The duties of border troops within the Berlin Wall zone were quite simple. They had to patrol the area around the Berlin Ring and to watch out for any attempt of an illegal crossing from the west, and especially from the east. They also performed the same task from the watchtowers. If someone was caught making a violation of the borderline, bordermen were allowed to shoot them down without orders. For this reason, many bordermen were trialed and sentenced after the German unification. Although the pay of border troops was a little bit better than the rest of the army, it was still very low compared to West German standards. Many dissatisfied soldiers planned escape attempts to West Germany. Since the division of Berlin, many were attempted, the most famous being the crossing of soldier Konrad Schumann on August 15, 1961. Konrad was serving at the border troops and was on his sentry duty at the line that day. At the time, East Germany just began to build the wall. As he was standing at his sentry post, watching his comrades on the patrol walking away from the line, he took the opportunity and ran across the barbed wire to West Berlin. In order to prevent such future incidents from happening, the army established a special protocol. Patrols, sentry posts, and watchtowers were always manned by 2 or 3 soldiers. In this way, if one decided to run to the west, the other could shoot him. Guard shifts lasted for 8 hours, and every soldier had at least one per day. In order to disrupt the pattern and prevent possible escapes, shift hours and patrol paths were prone to changes. Even the names of the soldiers on shift were kept secret. Another way to keep the bordermen obedient and in strict discipline was the use of state police, known as the Stasi. Stasi agents in the border troops wore the same uniforms and insignia and were used to gather information from the other side, but also to inspect the border troops for potential escapees. Every 10th officer and 1 in 30 soldiers was in collusion with the Stasi. Even though contact with West German guards was forbidden and control was strict, bordermen were making constant contact with their Western counterparts, exchanging insignia and newspapers. The Berlin Wall collapsed on November 9, 1989. Earlier, soldiers of the border troops had stood bewildered and overwhelmed as thousands of East Germans gathered near the wall, demanding to get through the checkpoints, a demand which they soon agreed to.
Daring escape attempts from East Germany, 1961 to 1989. Between 1961 and 1989, more than 100,000 citizens from East Germany tried to escape across the border. More than 600 of them were shot and killed by the border guards. At the Berlin Wall alone, 5,000 people attempted the crossing, and 100 of them were either shot, died accidentally, or committed suicide when they were caught by the authorities. Their attempts to escape ranged from being quite ingenious to downright suicidal. By armored personnel carrier. In 1963, Wolfgang Engels was a 20-year-old car mechanic and driver in the East German Army. One day, while his crew was at lunch, he stole a BTR-152 armored personnel carrier from his military base and drove it through the streets of East Berlin. On the way, he stopped and offered a group of young people a ride to freedom, but they laughed at him and declined his invitation. The police were used to seeing military vehicles on the road, so they halted the traffic to allow him to cross through the intersections without stopping. As he approached the Berlin Wall, he put his foot down and accelerated into it at speed, but got stuck halfway through. As he climbed out of the armored personnel carrier, he was shot at by East German border guards and hit twice, but he was pulled to safety by a West German guard from the other side. Engels was rushed to a nearby hospital where he eventually recovered from his wounds. He settled in West Germany and became a teacher, but his mother, a staunch communist, disowned him as a traitor and never spoke to him again. By tightrope. Horst Klein was a trapeze artist living in East Germany. He had been banned from performing his art for having anti-communist beliefs. Klein said that, quote, he couldn't live any longer without the smell of the circus, end quote. In early 1963, he made one of the most daring escapes of all. Klein climbed up an old disused electricity pylon and pulled himself hand over hand along one of the cables across the wall, almost 20 meters above the heads of the patrolling guards below. When his arms got tired, he swung his whole body up over the cable and shimmied his way along to the other side. Klein's descent wasn't particularly graceful, though. He fell off the cable and crashed to the ground, breaking both his arms. But he had landed on the other side of the wall and was now free to perform again. By zip wire. In 1983, 8 years after Ingo Bethke had escaped East Berlin, his brother Holger decided to follow him into the West. Ingo had crept over the border on a foggy night, carefully navigated the minefields, and paddled across the river Elbe on an inflatable air mattress. Holger had a brilliant idea. He was going to escape over the wall using a zip wire. For 2 weeks, he and his friend Michael Becker pretended to be circus performers and practiced their act in a public park. They were surveying the area for the perfect place to cross and made sketches of the area too. They took along a paper target and a bow and arrow and practiced doing archery, all the time firing at longer and longer distances. When they were confident that they were ready, Holger and Michael put on electrician's overalls as a disguise and went to an empty house alongside the border. They waited in the attic for over 13 hours and kept in constant radio contact with Ingo, who was on the other side of the border. As the agreed time neared, Ingo drove to the West German side of the wall and waited for his brother. Holger shot an arrow with a thin, narrow line attached to it that was connected to a 200-meter cable over the wall and towards the roof of an apartment building. But his first and second attempts failed to go over properly. After the third arrow flew over the roof and landed in West Berlin, Holger fastened his end of the cable inside the attic, and Ingo secured his end to the bumper of his car. Using homemade wooden pulleys and with a running start, Holger and Michael took off. Unfortunately, they had overestimated the downward angle of the cable run, and the pair gradually slowed down to a stop, hanging there over no man's land. Holger swung his legs up onto the wire and inched his way across to the apartment building on the other side, unnoticed by the border patrols below. He was closely followed by his friend minutes later, and they landed safely, and he was reunited with his brother. By tunneling. One group decided to build a tunnel to help rescue some of those stuck in the east. The excavation of this tunnel had taken about 5 months and was carried out by a group of between 20 and 25 West German college students. To avoid suspicious-looking trips in and out of the building, the students took it in turns to live in the basement for weeks on end, and by their own admission, they began to stink to high heaven, despite setting up makeshift washing facilities. It had been an extremely hazardous endeavor, as though the local sandy soil was very easy to dig through. It was also prone to collapsing due to its unstable nature, so it had to be shored up along the way with wooden boards. First of all, they had to dig a 30-foot vertical shaft before they could start on the horizontal tunnel, but the further they dug, the more difficult it became to breathe, so they adapted a household vacuum cleaner to blow air along the tunnel. The tunnel was a staggering 145 meters or 475 feet long and went directly underneath the Berlin Wall fortifications. But it was only 2 feet high and 3 feet wide, so there was just enough room for a person to crawl along, and it took approximately 10 minutes to cover the whole distance. It started on the western side of the city in the basement of a disused bakery, and then went across in an easterly direction and ran beneath some shops. Then under the Berlin Wall itself, before coming up vertically into an old disused outhouse or toilet block of the back of an apartment building, instead of the cellar of a building that had originally been planned as the exit. The escape was planned to happen on the weekend that coincided with a big celebration in the east of the city to mark the 15th anniversary of the founding of the East German Democratic Republic. Instructions were sent to friends and relatives in the East inviting them to escape, and they were told that they had to whisper the password Tokyo when they were near the tunnel entrance to distinguish themselves from any Stasi secret police who might be nosing about in the area. The password Tokyo was a reference to the Summer Olympics that were to be held in Tokyo, Japan, only 1 week later. Among the college students helping to organize the escape to the west was Reinhard Führer, who in later years became an astronaut and was a payload specialist on one of the Challenger space shuttle missions. A total of 54 adults and 3 children made their way across in groups of 2 to 3 that night in October, aided by their West German helpers. But just as the last group got across, a truckload of East German security guards turned up at the entrance to the tunnel after a tip-off from somebody reporting suspicious activity in the area. As the last of the West German helpers were about to cross back into West Germany, there was an exchange of gunfire between them and the East German security forces. In a brief firefight, a young East German border guard was hit several times and killed. None of the escapees or West German helpers were ever captured, and it ended up being a major embarrassment for the East German authorities. who afterwards claimed that the guard had been shot and murdered by West German agents, something that was denied by the West Germans. The guard who was killed was 21-year-old Sergeant Egon Schultz, who became a national hero in the East, and many streets, buildings, and schools were named after him. The escape was the largest ever recorded from the East to the West and became known simply as the story of Tunnel 57, due to the number of East Germans who had managed to escape to freedom that night. Decades later, after the unification of Germany, secret East German files revealed that Sergeant Schultz had indeed been hit in the crossfire with the students, but the shot that had actually killed him had been from friendly fire. His own men had accidentally shot him in all the confusion in the darkness. And a bizarre twist that later came to light was that the popular German Stern or Star magazine had partially funded the building of the tunnel in return for exclusive rights to the story.